Higher Universe Pictures.
Welcome to the Paranormal Phenomena Podcast with Brandon Reines and Elizabeth Chamberlain.
I'm Brandon Reines.
And I'm Elizabeth Chamberlain.
Welcome to the Paranormal Phenomena Podcast, where we talk about ghosts, aliens, and the unexplained. On today's show, we welcome back Morgan Knudsen, who we spoke with on our very first episode. Today, we discuss the topic of possession.
If you like our podcast, be sure to subscribe, and we'd love it if you could like, share, and comment on our show. Those likes go a long way in helping us reach a wider audience, and we really appreciate that.
Morgan, thank you for being back on the show.
Thank you for having me, as always. It's always so much fun. So yeah, I'm ready to go.
Yeah, you're our first returning guest, and we're glad to have you back. Morgan, I know that you have done some courses on the topic of possession before, and it's always something that's interested me. The Exorcist is one of my favorite horror movies, of course. I love the book. I've read it like many, many times. So I guess the first question is, everything in that movie is 100% real, right?
Oh, of course. Hollywood is always telling the truth. And I was just going to say, it's probably one of the most, I think, iconic horror films that's ever been made. I mean, it's anybody, I think, that even remotely thinks about the concept of exorcism, The Exorcist comes to mind instantly.
Yeah, I love the movie and everything. I like it as a movie, not as any source of reliable information. I read the book that the story was based on. It was actually a little boy in St. Louis, I think it was, in the 1940s, if I'm not mistaken. Right. And there's almost no connection between the book, what really happened in the movie. They changed pretty much every single point of it. The book was still very interesting, but one thing I liked about the Exorcist book is they really got into, like, is this real or is it not? Is it all in her mind? And every time it kind of started, like, maybe this is real, there was something, but maybe it's not. There's always kind of some explanation for it. And it's almost frustrating because the doctors are basically at a complete loss for what this could be, but they were unwilling to think it could be anything paranormal. So let's kind of get into it. What are your thoughts on the concept of possession?
It's so interesting because the concept itself of possession goes back just beyond what we can really comprehend, right back to, ancient Mesopotamia and the Assyrian tablets and Babylon and, all of these different historical things and these historical events. And, right into areas of Ethiopia, just all over the world, possession has been something that has been used as an excuse for a lot of things. It's been used for an explanation for a lot of things, a lot of medical conditions and things like that. But then there's like this small percentage that is unexplained. And I think for me, that's what's so fascinating is that, you've got all of these explanations and then you've got this tiny little percentage that remains unexplained. And more recently, it's actually been inducted into the DSM-5 by a colleague of mine, Etsy Cardenia. And, it's taken a very interesting turn throughout history. You hear at the beginning, it was used to break down, every possible illness. Like, for example, in places like Babylon, if every single medical problem was a demon, right? It was some sort of entity. It had to be some sort of entity. And in the Assyrian tablets, you go back far enough, and they found most recently one of these tablets that's got all these carvings in it, and on the back of it, they actually describe the condition of epilepsy, but they've got the wrong cause. They believe that the cause was possession, but they actually were detailed enough in understanding medical phenomenon that they were detailing, the fact that this was a disorder. So it's just, I don't know, I find the topic absolutely really fascinating to dig into.
That's so cool. Is possession something that people have to be worried about, do you think? Like, can you just be going about your life and then all of a sudden you become possessed? Like, what are the causes? How does it happen?
How does it happen? Well, so this is interesting because I was mentioning the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic Manual for Statistical Medicine, where basically all psychological and conditions and whatever, they're all listed in these volumes. And what's so interesting is that you could only get diagnosed with possession, what they call possession trance disorder, if it's negatively affecting your experience. And I bring this up in answer to your question because I think people assume that things like possession are always super negative. It's always something that's got a terrible connotation to it. And we think of movies like The Exorcist or The Rite or The Exorcism of Emily Rose and all of these different cases. But there's more cases of positive possession than there is of the negative. When we look at positive channels that are in our experience, people like Jane Roberts, Esther Hicks, unique people like that, Louis Benjamin, who was associated with my great-great-grandfather. And it's interesting because I think when we allow ourselves to tap into that which is non-physical, I think we are always open to be influenced in a really good way by energies that are around us. I think we can have that experience. And I don't think it's always a bad thing. I think when we get into the negative stuff is when, we've got people that are, really bottomed out and, they're allowing this stuff in a way that's just detrimental to their experience. But, I think ultimately, there are more positive cases of this than negative ones.
It's kind of strange because I remember reading like a lot about it in the movie Exorcist and the other movies you mentioned. It's like a foreign entity that has its own intelligence has come into them. They speak in a different voice. They have different memories. They're basically a different person. But a lot of what I've been reading, it's more like you said. It's a negative impact on their life. Kind of everything goes to shit basically. That's very different than like an intelligent ghost or demon or some sort of other thing that's basically controlling your body. Is that just like a Hollywood thing, or does that exist in the real world too?
Well, that's where it kind of gets interesting because when we look at the positive cases of channeling, where you can have a really positive dialogue with these intelligences that seem to be almost I guess the way people describe it is like downloading blocks of thought that they're translating, and then when they come out of that trance or whatnot, then they don't have any memory of it, but they're able to give this information. And I think with with the negative side of it, you hear the same thing where these people say, I don't remember anything about this. It's I don't remember hurting these people. I don't remember hurting myself. I don't remember. And I think so. I think when we get into some of the negative stuff, that like people seem to almost have this experience where their consciousness is kind of bumped out of the way. There was a book years ago that was written. It's really fascinating, called "Hostage to the Devil" by Malachi Martin. And Malachi Martin was a very controversial individual because he was a Jesuit priest, but specialized in exorcism. And that's the way he and his clients described it as well. It was like their consciousness kind of got bumped out, and something else seemed to be able to take its place. So that appears to be based on testimony and sort of a universal description of what happens.
There seems to be like a cure to it then. Like, how do people who are possessed have, get out of being possessed?
Well, like the cure ultimately, because I mean, I'm sure every culture, well, I know every culture has their magic formula. Some of them will turn around and say, it has to be a Christian formula, or it has to be, whatever their religion they're associating with. But simply, there isn't just one answer. There's universal answers to it, because all cultures seem to have some version of possession. So what we can look at is, instead of looking at the specifics of what we would consider like a cure, is look at the overall effect of what's happening. So usually what we'll see is two different things throughout various cultures. And the first is that you end up with a dominant presence in the space that is calling the person who is under possession, is calling them forward. They're calling them forward. They're not getting in the muck and mire with them. They're calling them forward. They're calling them to better, calling them to remember good memories, calling them to remember who they are, and this kind of thing. The second part of it is the person's decision. You know, when Malachi Martin discusses this in Hostage to the Devil, for instance, you know, he very much talks about the idea of getting that person to make the decision that they're going to want better. They want better. They don't want to stick with this newfound buddy that they've just made. And it sounds like a really weird dynamic that I'm talking about, but oftentimes what will happen in these cases is that that entity becomes kind of a not so good old friend. And it's sometimes that person has to make a decision to say, I don't want to sit in this anymore. I don't want to sit with this toxicity. And I don't, you know, I don't want to sit with this experience. I want something better. I want to improve my life. I want to find joy again. And sometimes getting them to make that decision is really, really tough. Because I mean, we all know people that are like that just without the complications of possession. They want to sit in their muck. And it's the same thing with exorcism. So yeah, so I think those are the two common denominators. If we take out the sort of the religious or ritual with it, those seem to be the two things. But I think making that decision on, you know, on a very base human level, it's a core decision. It seems to be one of the keys that brings people out of this.
I feel like, so I've seen in movies priests be like trying to expel the demon, you know, and be like, be gone, whatever. Is that not a thing then? Like, does that not happen?
Well, what's really interesting is that most, especially like in Catholic exorcisms, a lot of them are done in silence. The majority of them are done in silence, and it's an energetic conversation rather than a verbal conversation. And this, I always found that really interesting, because for me as an investigator, it's anytime you go into any sort of a haunted place, you're always having this energetic vibrational conversation with whatever's in the space. You know, negative entities, they read your energy. They don't care about what job you have or what bills you pay or, you know, what your title is. They care about how your energy is in the space. So they're responding to that. And it seems like in a lot of these cases, it's a very small percentage of cases that are deemed real, or actual supernatural phenomenon. It seems like that is very much how it continues. So it wears a lot of these, the people that do this, the exorcists, wears them right down. Usually they'll only, you know, maybe do 5 of them in their career, and then they're done. So it's interesting, but that energetic conversation seems to be far more important than the verbal, which in my experience is exactly right.
I know in people will probably recognize from the Conjuring movies, especially the whole infestation, what's the second one? Oppression, possession, that whole thing. I've heard that elsewhere too. Is that a real thing, or is that more in the movies? Like, you know?
Well, what I found is it's interesting, because that has been the model, like the Catholicism model for exorcism for decades, years and years. But when I started doing this research, with these intelligences, because we don't know what they are, we don't know what these entities are. Everybody's got a name for them. The Japanese call them the Oni. You've got demons in Catholicism. You've got the Kelpies in Scotland. I mean, everybody's got a name for them. But what I've found is that this approach has missed out on some fundamental factors with these intelligences just as a whole. And the one thing that I've noticed throughout my interactions with clients with negative entities and things like that is that really they exist in kind of a hierarchy. And where you sit on the hierarchy comes back to what Elizabeth was saying, which was it really depends on the energy that you're bringing in. It's almost like you're stepping into a pack of dogs, and you've got this pack of dogs, and they're going to determine where you sit on that ladder. And when you step out of line, they'll make a correction. And that correction will come sometimes as a bite, comes as scratch, can come all sorts of different ways, throwing objects, whatever. But ultimately what I've found is exactly that, is that it is more to do with dominance. It's more to do with sort of this hierarchy that they get going within a house. And so it's less about a formula that possession is always the end game, because there's tons of negative hauntings and upsetting experiences that happen where possession's not even on the table. And it is more about the entity kind of finding a hierarchy within its environment. It's really interesting to be around. And I found that if I'm dealing with something like that in a house, I can come into the space, and as long as I'm being, a calm, assertive, non-aggressive, hold my space, hold my own emotional state and whatnot, the run-ins that I have are actually pretty positive. So you can manage what's going on, but as soon as you dip into fear, dip into anger, upset, anything like that, it's gonna you start to rock the boat, and all of a sudden you end up in conflict with these things. So I think the idea that possession is the end game is it's a dated way of thinking, but it's definitely pervasive in all the Hollywood movies anyway.
That reminds me of like when we were talking in our first interview with you, on how like if you're more open to things, like they will find you or you will find them more easily. So I feel like if you're more open to like the world of possession and demons and stuff like that, you'll more easily find it. But are you therefore more at risk, or are you more able to stay safe because of these things you're talking about now? What do you think?
Well, I mean, state of expectation is huge. I mean, if you're going out into the world and you believe that the world is a harmful place and that this is going to, happen to you, I mean, you're kind of setting yourself up for a myriad of terrible things that happen, because our state of expectation is so powerful. And so if we're sitting in that negative emotional state, we have to remember that wherever we're sitting emotionally, we're resonating on the frequency of people, of spirits, of all sorts of things that are resonating with us. So we kind of fall onto the radar if we're feeling fearful and afraid and don't want to go out, or don't want to we're afraid of these things, like we're gonna resonate on every single thing and event that's gonna mirror back to us what that fear looks like. So I think our state of expectation is huge. We look at cases of possession specifically, like in the West, European continents and things like that, and often the people that end up either believing they are under possession or allegedly under possession are people who are very God-fearing people, like a fire and brimstone, fearful of hell, this kind of thing, very religious. So that, I think that says quite a lot as well.
What is the connection between possession and religion? Do you know why that happens?
Well, I think early on, I think it was very much utilized as a way to control people. Just as many of these factions, become very controlling. It's funny, if we go back to a place like Ethiopia, what they would end up doing, they had something called the czar possession strategy, and what it was, and this always cracks me up every time I talk about it, is that every time the wives were being disrespectful, then the men automatically assume, well, that must be possession, because if they're stepping out of line and they're disobeying me, it sure as hell isn't because of my wife doesn't have a voice.
Right.
But they used to turn around and say, that's, yeah. So they would drag their wives anyway to an exorcist, and they would say, you better fix this. And the wives ended up starting to catch on to this. And they realized that every time they went to the exorcist, the husband, of course, had to pay out a chunk of cash. So every single time that the husband began to do something that the wives didn't want, the wives would threaten possession. And be exorcised. The husband would have to fork out more money. So I mean, it goes back, I think, a really, really long time. As I say, we look at the Assyrian tablets, we see it there. We see it in way back in Catholicism, in Babylon, ancient Mesopotamia. All illnesses, as I say, were possession based. So I think it became eventually a way of controlling people, but it's also a way for, I think, sometimes people that have ignored negative emotion, that have ignored pain that's going on, to express that pain in a way that in that time period was acceptable. because, back, especially in that time period, if you were, if you were upset, dealing with a lot of that kind of thing wasn't necessarily acceptable. Women specifically didn't have a voice to do that, and whatnot. So you start to harbor all of this stuff, and and I think their explanations started to tie into, okay, well, that person must be possessed. If they're sick, they must be possessed. If it has to be something that's external. They hadn't clued in that it's like, wait a minute, everything that's happening, everything that's going on is coming from the inside out. And I think that's what we have to remember about possession as well. It's not something that's afflicted on us. It's that, illnesses, all of those things is something that, it begins with disease, disease. And there's got to be something off with us in order to be creating negativity like that. So I think it ties into religion in a bunch of ways, but again, it's the idea that we're out of control, something is out of control, and we're trying to put a label on it.
I remember watching a documentary came out fairly recently. I think it's the same guy that directed The Exorcist, and it was like a documentary done in modern day, like the last few years. And I think it was a woman from Italy who thought she was possessed. I found the movie, honestly, I found it quite boring. I didn't even watch the whole thing. It just was not interesting. But, and this is not like some weird religious woman too. I mean, she was religious, but I think she was like an architect. Like she was, a quote, normal person. I think they said that there's, in Italy in particular, a lot of this, a lot of people, it's a regular occurrence in Latin America, South America too. Maybe it's just places where Catholicism is bigger. This tends to happen a lot. I'm not aware of it in Canada or even the US. I'm not aware of it being a common occurrence, but apparently in some places it's exorcisms are done, kind of like surgeries are done here.
Yeah, very much so. And again, it's I think wherever they're rooted, spiritually, culturally, and we have to remember too, that even the people that, say for example, have a belief that their illness or something that's going on is being caused by possession. The interesting thing is that they can go under something, like experience something like an exorcism, or some sort of a ritual with that same desired effect, and walk out and they end up seemingly cured. And again, we have to look at state of expectation. Is what's happening, is their belief matching up with what they believe is going on? And if so, we have the mind is a really, really powerful thing. We can create in our world and create in our reality and change our our physical state, our all of that, by how we think. And if we believe, like the placebo effect, if we believe that this is something that's going to cure us, it's amazing how the body will respond to that. So I mean, yeah, absolutely.
So do you think maybe the priests, it's kind of the quicker way to deal with it? They could send these people to a doctor, to a psychiatrist, and they just, they would refuse it. It's like, what, I could just tell them okay, the demon's gone, and then subconsciously they'll be back to normal.
I haven't run into any cases where they've just thought, okay, this is just a quick fix. Usually there is really a belief that this is what's going on, that they genuinely think that there is some sort of external presence that's there, that's creating an illness or whatever. And I think the problem with that is the fact that the empowerment factor, at least for me, is missing. Because at that point, as soon as you're relying on the external to fix an emotional problem, that becomes an issue. There's not really anywhere that's addressing the emotional issue that's underlying what created, whether it be a disease, whether it be a genuine possession, whether it be whatever's going on in that person's experience, mental illness, whatever it is. My problem is the lack of the encouraging that person's empowerment. I think that can be a big problem. If they believe that that's what's going on, that's great, but there's an emotional undercurrent to all of it. You guys mentioned the Exorcist story, the real story, which was in 1949. It was a little boy by the name of Roland Doe, or they called him Roland Doe, and whatnot. And very few people realize that he was brought up, first of all, in an extremely strict family. He wasn't a happy kid, and he had undergone or suffered the loss of an aunt. Her name was Aunt Tilly, that was very, very close to him. Like, they were extremely close. They were like best friends. And his Aunt Tilly was trying to lean him into the paranormal, the supernatural, was messing around with Ouija board, all sorts of things like that. And not in a negative way, but that loss that he incurred, I don't know if that loss was ever addressed. And within a very short amount of time, he claimed that he was talking with something that called itself Aunt Tilly. I'm guessing it was not. And then he started, there started to, be occurrences that were happening in the house, like, furniture moving, coat hangers being ripped out of closets, all sorts of crazy things. And the next thing you know, you've got this situation where the, kids in the hospital because these, there seems to be, or they're claiming it's possession. So, but again, like, at what point is that issue underneath addressed? And, as far as my research could tell, it really wasn't.
That's so interesting. I wonder, so like you were saying that possession is now in the DSM-5 and like, psychological disorder it's diagnosed as now. But then you were also saying that, like, as you just said, that there's something underneath that's causing this. So if you're a psychiatrist or a psychologist or whatnot, and you can identify that problem underneath, is an exorcism even needed, or could you fix it from the source,
Yeah, it's a really good question. There's a fellow by the name of Dr. Morgan Scott Peck, and he actually worked with Malachi Martin as a consulting psychologist for a little while. I think it was psychologist. I could be psychiatrist. I don't remember, but he was taking Malachi Martin's clients and assessing them before they were being turned over for potential exorcism. And I think a lot of these people, I'm of the belief that I think if those emotional wounds are addressed and healed, I think there is no room at that point for that level of negativity to start moving in, and I think that goes for everybody, not just the paranormal side of it, but everybody. If you make the space, for that healing, that positivity, all of that, immediately you're pulling yourself off the radar of the negative stuff, and you're getting into the, you're getting into the more positive things. And so I think, if you can heal that stuff, and it's been my experience with my clients over the years, that once you heal that up, then immediately what starts to change in your environment in regards to the paranormal is massive. It's just massive. There's a huge shift, and you start experiencing the really positive and fun stuff.
Oh, that's kind of wholesome.
It is.
So what do you think causes you mentioned that some of the cases, probably a small percentage, there's a paranormal element involved, levitation, things flying around the room. What would cause that?
Well, there's the $1 million question is what is it? And I don't think that question's been completely answered. There seems to be an intelligence that's there that is separate and apart from the person that's there. Whether or not we're looking at an explosion of psychokinesis, psychokinetic energy, or PK, a poltergeist activity that's actually coming from the person, or whether that's something that's coming from, a different consciousness. That's a big question. And I don't think we've got an answer to that yet, but I think there's a number of things that are on the table, as say PK being one of the big ones, that, we've got a million reports in parapsychology of this happening, where people in a high level of emotional state, usually anger, rage, extreme frustration, things like that, will explode with psychokinesis, or bouts of psychokinesis, and things go flying across the room. And of course, when we look at cases of exorcism and stuff, you've got this person who is seemingly in extreme anguish, and all of a sudden, bam, this stuff starts happening around them. So the question becomes, is this something that's being caused by an invading intelligence, or is this somebody who is literally wrought in such negative emotion that they're able to just, cause this stuff to explode?
I wonder if there's also another possibility of like, it's still an external source, but they're causing the negative emotion on the person, and then the person's causing the actual actions,
Yeah, it's an interesting concept. But normally, like, again, we kind of have to go back and look at what's going on with that person. Somebody wouldn't be susceptible to something like that if they didn't already weren't resonating, right, on that emotional level. So I think no matter what angle we look at, it still comes back to the individual, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's like chicken and egg, but yeah, that's so funny. So Brandon and I were talking, and when we were researching this stuff, we heard that possession's on the rise, that it's happening more and more in the world right now. Is that true? Is that something you've heard?
I keep hearing that, and it's so hard to know, because a lot of these people that are claiming that they're diagnosing things like possession really aren't qualified to diagnose something like possession. So it's really hard to say. You get all these different religions and authorities and so on and so forth that are saying this person's possessed, or that's possession, or this possession. But ultimately, the process these people go through to get a clinical diagnosis of possession is extreme. Like, they're going through multiple doctors and specialists and all of the. So I mean, for me, I don't think there's that many people out there that are going through that lengthy process to get certified as possessed. And as I say, like, the people who are ultimately diagnosed with something like possession trance disorder in the DSM-5, it doesn't include the people that are having wonderfully positive experiences with channeling and communicating with that source energy and all of that. They're not counted. So I mean, it's hard to know what the numbers are.
I personally, I have a hard time believing that. I mean, I have to figure that over the decades, over the centuries, with modern medicine and what we understand about like psychiatry and mental illness, there's going to be fewer and fewer exorcisms. So I don't understand how all of a sudden there could be an explosion in genuine cases. I have the feeling it's basically super religious people sharing this on social media, and it gets shared around, and it's not an actual epidemic that is a real thing. That's my thoughts. I just wondered if you perhaps knew something that we didn't.
Yeah,
I think you guys are right on that. I think, as I say, like, the process that it takes to get diagnosed with this, or or go through even with the Catholic Church, the process is extremely lengthy. So I have a hard time believing that we've got some sort of an explosion in it. And as I say, I don't think there's that many doctors out there in general that are diagnosing it. So there's that too. So I think there's a lot of mitigating factors, and the fact also that there is such a stigma in the world of medicine about paranormal activity anyway. So people coming forward and saying, I think there's something going on, the odds of them turning to a paranormal explanation are pretty slim. And sometimes that can be a really unfortunate thing, because people kind of get left in the dirt with their hey, I think I saw a loved one that's passed away, and automatically they're labeled with oh, you're not coping well, or you must be hallucinating, there must be something wrong with you. Like, you automatically get labeled that way. So I mean, even the people that are coming forward with it, the odds of them, I think, getting diagnosed or being told something spiritual had happened to them is slim.
I remember it was actually, I think, the first day we met, when Cynthia and I took your ghost tour in the bus. You played a clip from the Enfield poltergeist case in the UK, the little girl that was allegedly possessed by the old man, and very, very scary voice. I mean, it's kind of traumatizing listening to that. It's pretty freaky. I've heard debates over the years of whether or not it's real, because one, how could she sound like that at her age? But they say, well, it could just be, you scream and yell enough and your vocal cords get all roughed up, and then you could talk. I mean, there's kind of back and forth whether or not that's genuine. What are your thoughts on that?
I personally think the Enfield case was genuine. The Society of Psychical Research is on board with that as well. The people that investigated, like Maurice Grosse, extremely reputable investigator. I don't think he was wrong, and I don't think the affidavits of the hundreds of people that experienced it was wrong. I think with Janet Hodgson was the little girl's name. I think one of the most profound experiments that they did during the Enfield haunting was when they they had everybody take a sip of water in the room, and they duct taped everybody's mouth shut. And of course, needless to say, it was to prevent things like ventriloquism and stuff like that. And at the end of the entire thing, if somebody didn't spit the water out, it was obviously that they were hoaxing it. And at the end of these sessions, everybody spit that water out. They said multiple times that the voice wasn't coming from Janet, it was coming from behind her. And so there was a couple of, I think, discrepancies, like especially in the movie, where they had her kind of doing the talking, and in reality they were experiencing it kind of in the environment, not just coming out of Janet, but was in the environment as well. But there was a lot there, and I think where the problem came in was that they did in fact catch Janet faking stuff. And it was really a nail in the coffin for them, because even though they had genuine phenomenon going on, I mean, you get caught faking that once, and you're going to have a real hard time getting people to believe you.
Right. That sucks.
Yeah.
Have you had a lot of experiences with exorcism and things like that, and possession? I'm not familiar with your experience.
Yeah, I haven't had a ton, thankfully, but at least in the negative area, but I've definitely had a number in the positive. And being able to, just even for myself, when I'm meditating, when I'm able to get quiet and things like that, having information dropped on me, being able to calm myself enough and listen and open up and kind of, I guess, surrender, and be in that state of allowing, and having information, come in that I shouldn't have known, or, having, answers to questions, responded to, things like that. So, I mean, I've definitely had some pretty positive things, happen in that regard. And my great-great-grandfather, one of his main projects in life, he was a very noted physician from Ontario, and dead skeptic, like complete skeptic. He had some really interesting experiences, and as I say, his main project when he was alive, he was a very noted physician, very famous in Ontario, Albert Durant Watson, and dead skeptic, absolute dead skeptic. And he ended up coming in contact with this fellow Louis Benjamin, who channeled a group of energies that they called themselves the humble ones of the 20th plane. And he ended up publishing 2 books based off of Louis Benjamin's, it wasn't Louis Benjamin, but the humble ones, their discussions and what they would tell him. And this guy, I mean, because Louis Benjamin, he had like a grade 4 education. I mean, this guy he didn't have the know-how for a lot. And the stuff that he was coming out with was so profound. And looking back, this was, early 1900s that this was happening. And the information that he has, I have both these books, was so profound, so beyond its time. It's inspirational, it's beautiful, and was very much juxtaposed to the stuff that was going on in seances at the time period. Where everything was really being considered as frightening and scary. And my great-great-grandfather got laughed at. He was told, this is silly. This is, what are you doing? And he said, you know what? You can either take it or leave it, figure it out. But he's like, this is what we experienced, and this is what I documented. This is it. And so that was had a huge effect on me. I didn't find out he was my great-great-grandfather until about 6 years into Entity Seeker. But reading those books was definitely a huge influence on my perception of what the spirit world is. And now, talking with people who have had, either, you know, these positive possession experiences, whether they be clients or whatever. And then you hear people that have come back from near-death experiences that are reporting the same thing. You know, I think my experiences, you know, even though I've had a few myself, have really come through these other people. I've only run into one case in my career that I pointed to, and I could say, you know what, that might have been possession, like a negative possession. And but other than that, it seems to be predominantly a positive thing.
Nice.
So I guess what it comes down to is you don't have to walk around worrying about being possessed. There's not, you know, certain movies you could watch and you're gonna get possessed. You know, if you go into a bar, you're gonna get possessed. You don't go to church, you're gonna get possessed. It's really not like sometimes you were told when you were a kid.
Yeah, exactly. And you know, and as I say, it's funny because, you know, you go back to like ancient Mesopotamia, and that's exactly what they thought. It was, you know, you could walk down the street and it would, you know, you were in trouble. So I mean, they kind of had a monopoly on this thing. It was pretty amazing. And yeah, like I think you know, when we look at the I think the fear that has really been driven into us about spirituality, about the spirit world, about even the paranormal and things like that. And you know, I think we have to realize that so much of that, it makes for great TV shows, and it's very you know, great movies and horror movies and all of that kind of thing. But you know, the risk of something like, you know, even just getting hit by a car, you know, you kind of have to weigh. And I don't think possession works quite as randomly as what people think it does.
Well, thank God. I'm gonna sleep better tonight knowing that. Well, I think we'll wrap it up there. We're pretty much out of time. That was a very interesting conversation. Thank you so much for being on the show again. And Morgan, we'll have to definitely have you back soon.
Sounds perfect to me.
I love our interviews with Morgan. You're very knowledgeable, Morgan, and also very like kind at the same time. It's really like refreshing to talk to you.
Oh, thank you. I feel the same way about you guys. I love being on here, and yeah, we get such great conversation going, and it's fantastic. So
yeah.
Thanks for listening to the Paranormal Phenomena Podcast. See you next time.